In the heart of a lush valley, cradled by rolling hills and dense forests, lay a village unlike any other. This village, named Nkoyo, was nestled along the winding banks of a great river that had been the lifeblood of the community for generations. The river was more than just a source of water, it was a giver of life, a silent guardian that had watched over the people through countless seasons. Every dawn, fishermen would cast their nets into its shimmering depths, children would play along its muddy edges, and farmers would draw from its cool currents to nurture their crops. The village thrived because of this river, and the villagers revered it with a deep and abiding respect. Nkoyo was a peaceful place, where the rhythm of life followed the gentle flow of the river itself. Homes made from sun-baked earth and timber stood clustered together beneath towering baobab trees, their broad canopies sheltering the inhabitants from the heat of the midday sun. The air was thick with the scent of blooming wildflowers and the soft hum of cicadas. Laughter and song often drifted across the water, echoing the joy and harmony that had long defined the village's way of life. The people were bound by shared traditions, stories, and a deep connection to the land and water that sustained them. Among the villagers, there was one person who stood apart in the hearts and minds of all, a young woman named Omoni. She was known not only for her rare beauty but for a presence that seemed to shimmer with something otherworldly, as if she carried the river's own spirit within her. Her eyes, the color of polished amber, held a wisdom beyond her years, and her voice had a gentle timbre that could soothe the most troubled soul. Omoni moved with a grace that mirrored the river's flow, calm yet powerful, and wherever she went, flowers seemed to bloom more brightly, and the air felt lighter. From childhood, Omoni had shared a mysterious bond with the river. Villagers often whispered that the water responded to her touch and her voice in ways no one else could understand. When she waded into the shallow pools, the fish would gather around her feet as if drawn by an invisible thread. On many quiet evenings, she could be found sitting by the riverbank, eyes closed, listening to its soft murmur as if it were speaking secrets meant only for her. This bond was a source of comfort and strength for Omoni, and the villagers took comfort in her presence, believing she was somehow blessed by the river's spirit itself. But beneath the surface of this tranquil existence, tension had begun to creep into the village like a slow poison. Old rivalries between village factions, once held in check by tradition and mutual respect, were starting to fray. Some believed that their village's prosperity had attracted envy from neighboring tribes, while others whispered of a dark power rising beyond the forests. The elders had begun to speak in hushed tones of a powerful enemy, unseen but growing, whose greed and malice threatened to upset the delicate balance that had been preserved for centuries. The villagers felt the stirrings of unease but struggled to grasp the true nature of the danger looming on their horizon. At the heart of these fears was an ancient legend, passed down from generation to generation but dismissed by most as mere superstition. It was said that long ago, a shadow had been cast over the river by a malevolent force, a curse born of darkness and pain that could choke the life from the waters if ever fully unleashed. This shadow curse was whispered about only in the quietest corners of the village, a tale told around dying fires but never openly acknowledged. According to the legend, the river spirit, guardian of life and fertility, had been challenged by this shadow long ago and had fought to keep it at bay. The river's flow was said to depend on the spirit's strength and the balance of light and shadow that kept the land alive. To lose this balance would mean disaster for the village and all who relied on the river's mercy. Omoni, though young, was aware of these stories and carried a heavy burden she rarely spoke of. She felt a deep unease whenever she was near the river these days. The gentle current that had once danced playfully against the stones now seemed sluggish and hesitant. Fish that had always thrived were fewer in number, and the trees along the banks began to droop as if weighed down by an invisible sorrow. Even the animals, usually so attuned to the river's moods, grew restless and uneasy. Birds would take flight in sudden panic, and small creatures would scurry away at the slightest sound. A chill had settled over the valley, unnatural and creeping, as if winter's breath had come too early and too harsh. More unsettling still was the way the river seemed to respond differently to Omoni herself. The connection that had once been a source of joy and strength now felt strained, like a thread stretched too thin. When she reached out to the water, it shivered under her touch, cold and distant, refusing to welcome her as it always had. At times, she could swear she saw shadows flickering just beneath the surface, dark shapes that slipped away whenever she tried to focus on them. The villagers noticed her growing worry, though few understood its cause. They whispered that perhaps even the river's spirit was weakening, its power diminished by some unseen threat. The weight of these ominous signs pressed heavily on Omoni's shoulders. She could feel the river's pain as if it were her own, a silent cry for help that echoed through her very being. Yet, despite the fear and uncertainty, a spark of hope remained. Deep within her, a quiet determination took root, a promise that she would do whatever it took to protect the river and the village she loved. Whatever shadow had fallen upon the land, she vowed to uncover its source and restore the river's flow before it was too late. And so, as the village of Nkoyo stood on the edge of an uncertain future, with the river's song growing faint and the shadows lengthening, Omoni prepared herself for a journey that would test her courage, her spirit, and the mysterious bond she shared with the river, a journey that would change her life and the fate of her people forever. Far beyond the borders of Nkoyo, hidden deep within the dense, tangled forests where sunlight barely pierced through the thick canopy, a secretive group gathered under the cloak of darkness. They called themselves the Umnyama, an ancient and feared tribe whose existence was whispered about but rarely confronted. The Umnyama had long harbored envy and bitterness toward Nkoyo's prosperity. For generations, they had watched the river sustain the village, nurturing crops and filling bellies, while their own lands suffered drought and hardship. Their envy had turned to hatred, and their hatred to dark resolve. They would bring the river to a halt, break Nkoyo's lifeline, and watch it crumble beneath the weight of despair. The Umnyama were masters of shadow magic, an ancient art passed down through secretive rites and dark pacts. Their shamans were said to command powers that bent light and twisted souls, weaving curses that could strangle life itself. For years, they had sought a way to cut the river's flow, to shatter the invisible bond between the water and the village. They believed that by capturing the essence of the one who held the river's favor, the young woman named Omoni, they could strike the village at its very heart. On a moonless night, when the village slept and the river's song was but a faint whisper, the Umnyama struck. They had been watching Omoni for weeks, waiting for a moment when she was alone, vulnerable, and unaware. As she sat by the riverbank, lost in quiet meditation, the shamans moved silently through the shadows. Using a rare and forbidden spell, they reached out and seized her shadow, tearing it free from her body like a dark wisp of smoke. The air grew cold, and the water stilled as the shadow was pulled away, leaving Omoni's figure behind but something vital missing. This stolen shadow was no ordinary fragment of her being. The Umnyama's shamans chanted ancient incantations around a flickering fire, weaving the shadow into a potent curse. With every whispered word, the shadow twisted and writhed, becoming a living darkness charged with malice and despair. Their ritual bound the shadow to the river itself, a cruel tether designed to choke the flow and bring death to the village. The curse was more than just magic, it was a weapon forged from the stolen essence of the one who loved the river most. As the final words of the curse were spoken, a terrible change swept over the land. The river, once vibrant and teeming with life, began to slow, its currents sluggish and reluctant. Within days, the water retreated from the banks, exposing cracked mud and parched earth where the river had once flowed freely. Fish died in tangled heaps, and the crops, once lush and green, wilted under the relentless sun. The village's wells ran dry, and the air grew thick with despair. Panic gripped Nkoyo like a sudden storm. Mothers clutched their children, eyes wide with fear, while elders gathered in urgent council, their faces etched with worry. Whispers spread like wildfire, some spoke of witchcraft, convinced that dark forces had been unleashed upon them. Others dismissed such talk as superstition, desperate to cling to reason even as their world unraveled. Blame rippled through the community, some accused outsiders, others muttered about betrayal from within. The once united village fractured under the weight of fear. Omoni was at the center of this storm, caught between disbelief and horror. She felt the river's pain as if it were her own, but the cruelest blow was the loss of her shadow, the very essence that connected her to the water. She tried desperately to reach out, to summon the strength she knew she possessed, but it was as if an invisible chain held her back. Every attempt to break the curse was met with failure, leaving her feeling helpless and isolated. the villagers' eyes sometimes turned to her with suspicion, their hope waning alongside the river's flow. Yet, despite her fear and doubt, Omoni's spirit did not break. She knew deep within that the shadow held the key to the curse, and only by reclaiming it could the river be freed. The path ahead was shrouded in darkness, and the enemy was cunning and powerful. But the bond between Omoni and the river was stronger than any curse. Somewhere beyond the shadows, hope still flickered, waiting for her courage to ignite it once more. As the days stretched into weeks, the village of Nkoyo felt the cruel grip of the curse tighten with relentless force. The once vibrant fields, which had yielded abundant harvests for generations, lay barren and cracked under the scorching sun. Where thick stalks of maize and lush cassava had once swayed gently in the breeze, now only dry dust and withered leaves remained. The earth, thirsty and unforgiving, swallowed the farmers' hopes along with the failing crops. Hunger gnawed at bellies, and the cries of hungry children echoed through the empty streets. It was as if the life itself was being drained from the land. Water, the village's sacred gift, had become a memory. The great river, which had carved its path through the valley since time immemorial, now flowed weakly, barely more than a trickle in many places. Wells that had once offered cool relief now held only dust and cracked clay. Women carried empty pots from door to door, pleading for even a sip of water to quench the burning thirst of their families. The relentless sun beat down mercilessly, and the air seemed thick with despair and silence. The animals that once thrived alongside the river had vanished, leaving the village feeling hollow and abandoned. As desperation grew, the bonds that had once held the village together began to unravel. Fear and suspicion spread like wildfire, turning neighbor against neighbor. Families, strained by hunger and hardship, quarreled over dwindling resources. Some whispered darkly in marketplaces and around flickering fires, accusing unseen forces of bringing this calamity upon them. Among the voices of blame, one name was whispered more than any other: Omoni. The young woman who had once been the village's cherished guardian of the river now found herself at the center of their wrath. Rumors swirled that Omoni's mysterious connection to the river was not a blessing but a curse. If her shadow has been stolen, perhaps it was taken for a reason, some said in fearful tones. Maybe she brought this upon us. The weight of these accusations pressed heavily upon her heart. Those she had once called friends now crossed the street to avoid her gaze, and the children who had once followed her laughter now looked away with suspicion. Omoni's spirit, already burdened by the curse, was further battered by the isolation that came with distrust. Inside, she wrestled with a storm of conflicting emotions. Guilt gnawed at her relentlessly. Was she truly responsible for the village's suffering? Could she have done something to prevent the shadow's theft? At the same time, a fierce determination burned within her. She knew that the curse was linked to the stolen shadow and that reclaiming it was the only way to save her people and restore the river's flow. Yet confusion clouded her mind. What exactly had the shadow become? How was it twisted into such a powerful curse? The answers eluded her, leaving her to wander a path shrouded in darkness. Amid this turmoil, a few bright lights emerged to guide her through the growing storm. First was Zuri, a childhood friend whose loyalty had never wavered. Zuri's laughter was a balm to Omoni's weary soul, and her unwavering faith in the heroine's innocence brought moments of comfort. She believed in the bond between Omoni and the river, and her presence reminded the young woman that she was not alone. Then there was Elder Cato, the village's wise and revered elder. Cato had seen many seasons come and go, and his eyes held the knowledge of countless stories and ancient wisdom. He listened patiently to Omoni's fears and doubts, offering guidance without judgment. Cato reminded her of the old legends, of the power within the river and the courage needed to face shadows both real and imagined. His steady voice was a beacon of hope, grounding Omoni when the weight of her burden threatened to overwhelm her. Not all were convinced, however. Among the villagers was Baraka, a skeptic who dismissed the curse as superstition. Baraka was a pragmatic man, a trader who had traveled far beyond the valley and seen the world change. He doubted that a stolen shadow could wield such power and believed that the village's troubles had more earthly causes. Yet, despite his doubts, Baraka was unwilling to stand by idly. His practical mind sought solutions, and though he questioned the legends, he offered his aid, driven by a desire to help the village survive. Together, these three formed a fragile circle of support around Omoni, bolstering her resolve as the village's fate hung in the balance. With their encouragement, she made a decision that was as daunting as it was necessary. She would embark on a journey beyond the valley to break the curse. The path ahead was unknown, fraught with danger and uncertainty, but she understood that to save Nkoyo, she must confront the shadows that had stolen her essence and the life of the river. The village's reaction to Omoni's decision was as fractured as the land itself. Some saw her choice as a beacon of hope, a courageous step that could restore their lives and heal the wounded river. They gathered at the riverbank to bid her farewell, offering blessings and whispered prayers. Others viewed her departure with suspicion or outright hostility, convinced that her shadow was the source of their woes. Some accused her of abandoning them in their darkest hour, while others feared that her journey would bring even greater danger. Despite the divisions, Omoni's heart remained steadfast. The whispers of doubt and blame could not drown the quiet voice within her, the voice that called her to fight for the river, for her people, and for the fragile hope that still flickered like a candle in the night. With Zuri by her side, Elder Kato's wisdom guiding her, and Baraka's pragmatic support, she stepped into the unknown, determined to reclaim what was lost and restore the river's sacred flow before it was too late. Long before the river's gentle murmur had become a hollow whisper, long before the curse had stolen the life from Nkoyo, Omoni's story had already begun, woven into the fabric of the river itself, hidden beneath layers of legend and forgotten truths. Her birth was unlike any other in the village, shrouded in mystery and the kind of quiet wonder that only those who believed in the unseen could grasp. It was said that on the night of a rare celestial event, when the stars aligned in a pattern known only once every century, Omoni came into the world. Her mother, a humble healer with a deep reverence for the river, had gone into labor beside its banks, bathed in the ethereal light of the moon and stars. The midwives whispered that as the child took her first breath, a ripple passed through the water, and the river's song seemed to swell in joyous recognition. The village elders said this was no ordinary child, but one born with the blessing of the river spirit, a guardian destined to walk between worlds and hold the delicate balance of life and water. As Omoni grew, it became clear that her connection to the river was unlike any other. She could sense the subtle shifts in the water's mood, the way it danced with the wind or recoiled from unseen threats. Her shadow, in particular, held a strange significance. It was said to be tethered not just to her body, but to the spirit of the river itself. Unlike ordinary shadows that merely mirrored form and movement, hers seemed to ripple with a life of its own, sometimes stretching longer, darker, or even seeming to shimmer faintly beneath the midday sun. Elders whispered of an ancient prophecy, one buried deep in the scrolls of time, that spoke of a child of the river whose shadow would carry the power to protect or destroy. The shadow was the physical manifestation of the bond between the guardian and the spirit, a bridge between the earthly and the ethereal. This sacred bond was both a gift and a burden. As Omoni grew into womanhood, her role as the village's guardian became clearer and heavier. She was both revered and watched closely, for such power demanded respect and fear. The river spoke to her in ways no one else could understand, and she, in turn, nurtured it with a gentle hand and a steadfast heart. But the very strength of this bond also made her vulnerable to those who coveted it. Years before the curse darkened Nkoyo, Omoni's disappearance had already stirred the village's heart. It was a time of unrest, when threats from beyond the forest edges grew bolder and darker. Some say she vanished by her own choice, retreating into isolation to protect her people from the danger her power might attract. Others whispered of darker fates, that she had been taken by those who sought to use her connection for their own ends, a victim of betrayal and violence. The truth was tangled in shadows as deep as the riverbed, known only to a few and guarded fiercely by the elders. Despite her absence, the shadow that had been stolen did not fade into oblivion. Instead, it lingered in the cursed form the Unyama had woven, a dark, twisting presence bound to the river itself. The river's refusal to flow was a cruel echo of her absence, a silence that screamed across the valley. Without Omoni's presence, the delicate balance was shattered. The water grew still, the earth cracked, and the life that once thrived on the river's edge began to wither. It was as if the river waited, silent and unforgiving, until its guardian returned to restore the sacred bond. The elders, those keepers of wisdom and history, gathered in the fading light of day to remind the villagers of the old stories, tales passed down through generations, warnings etched in memory like the scars of the land. They spoke of shadows as more than mere absence of light, describing them as echoes of the soul, reflections of the unseen forces that shape the world. To steal a shadow was to steal a piece of one's essence, and to break the balance with nature was to invite chaos and despair. The river spirit, they said, was a living force of creation and destruction, demanding respect and harmony. When that harmony was broken, nature itself rebelled. As the river's silence grew heavier with each passing day, so did the tension in the village. The air hung thick with unspoken fear, and the nights grew colder, touched by an unnatural chill that seemed to seep from the very earth. The villagers felt the river's absence in their bones. No longer a gentle companion, it had become a void, a wound that refused to heal. Their prayers turned desperate, and their hope flickered faintly against the gathering darkness. Amid this growing despair, the weight of the prophecy and the burden of the shadow settled squarely on Omoni's shoulders, even in her absence. The river would not flow again until she returned, until the broken bond was mended and the curse lifted. And though the path back to Nkoyo was shrouded in shadows and danger, the heartbeat of the river, steady and unyielding, called her home. The decision to find Omoni was not made in a gathering or proclaimed by drums and horns. It began in silence, in the heart of one who knew her best, Kilo, the orphan boy she had taken under her wing. He had grown beside her, watched her speak to the river and soothe its anger when no one else could. When she vanished, his world dimmed, and now, as the river dried into cracked earth, Kilo could no longer bear the weight of waiting. The elders had spoken of ancient prophecies and lost shadows, but Kilo only cared about the girl who once braided his hair and promised him that love could mend what fear had broken. He was not alone for long. Joining him was Mara, a hunter's daughter with eyes like burning coals and feet that moved like wind. And with them came Elder Bako, the oldest living man in Nkoyo, who remembered things others had forgotten, symbols in the stars, the paths the spirits once walked, and the cost of ignoring their whispers. Together, they formed a strange trio, a boy, a warrior, and a man nearly swallowed by age. But what bound them was their unshaken belief that Omoni could be found, and that the river would not forgive them if they did not try. Their journey led them away from the bones of their dying village and into the Wura forest, a place where the trees whispered the names of the dead, and shadows did not always belong to something solid. The ground was soft and deceptive, often leading them in circles, and the wind carried voices, some familiar, some not. It was here that Mara's courage was first tested. One night, a mist coiled around them and formed the shape of her long-dead brother, who spoke sweet lies and beckoned her toward the edge of a cliff. It took Kilo's frantic voice and Elder Bako's chance to pull her back. Shaken but alive, she whispered, "This forest feeds on grief." As they pressed deeper into the unknown, the forest gave way to the broken ridge, a vast mountain range where the wind howled like a beast and time itself seemed uncertain. They climbed through days and nights that bled together, sleeping on rock and drinking from frozen springs. Here, they encountered the three-winged owl, a creature of both knowledge and riddles. It blocked their path and demanded a truth from each of them before granting passage. Mara spoke first. "I am not brave because I fear nothing. I am brave because I carry my fear like a blade." The owl's third eye blinked once. Kilo said, "I do not want to save her for the river. I want to save her because I cannot imagine the world without her voice." The owl nodded. Elder Bako hesitated longest, then said, "I lived long enough to see mistakes become tradition. This quest is not just about Omoni. It is about redemption, for all of us." Satisfied, the owl gave them a feather, glowing gold, that would guide them through the spirit realm where Omoni's presence last lingered. With heavy limbs and hopeful hearts, they crossed the final ridge and entered the veiled valley, a realm caught between the living and the dead, where time folded and memories walked like men. Inside the valley, they encountered ghosts of the past, long-forgotten warriors and grieving mothers who whispered secrets and warnings. One spirit, an old river priestess named Nala, spoke of Omoni's shadow. "It was not just stolen," she said. "It was torn. Ripped from her like skin, leaving a wound that bleeds across the land. To restore her, she must want to return. And to want to return, she must remember who she is. Meanwhile, Omoni fought her own battle in a liminal space between water and void. She drifted in a dream where the river called to her, but her voice echoed hollowly. Her shadow, twisted and dark, followed her like a chain. It whispered lies. You are the reason they suffer. You are the curse. She tried to speak against it, but the words turned to ash in her mouth. Then one night, in the shadow-drenched place where she lay half-conscious, she felt the pull of something warm, a voice calling her name with the desperation of love. Kilo's voice. It broke through the fog like sunlight through thick branches. And with it, memories rushed in, laughter on the riverbank, her mother's song, the scent of crushed hibiscus on her hands. She stood, staggering, reaching out for her shadow. You are mine, she said, not with anger but with truth. You are me, and I am not your enemy. The shadow quivered, flickered, and for the first time, softened. But danger was not far. The Umnyama, sensing the rescue mission, had sent their watchers, creatures with faces made of bark and eyes of burning coal, to stop them. Kilo and Mara fought with everything they had. Mara's blade flashed like lightning, and Kilo, though barely more than a boy, used the owl's feather as a shield of light. Elder Bako, too, stood firm, chanting old words that called upon forgotten gods to protect the innocent. The clash echoed across realms, drawing Omoni toward the battle. As she emerged from the shadow realm, still fragile but filled with growing strength, her presence turned the tide. The watchers recoiled, their forms unraveling in her light. Her shadow, once a curse, rejoined her with a brilliant flare, and the valley trembled as balance returned. But the journey was not over. They still had to return to Nkoyo, where the river waited, silent and still, to see if its guardian had truly returned. And Omoni, though reunited with her essence, knew the hardest test was yet to come, to face the village that had once turned against her and to prove that some bonds, like those of water, spirit, and love, cannot be broken forever. The land trembled with expectation as Omoni and her allies neared the edge of the spirit realm, where the veil between worlds thinned into vapor. The journey back to the world of the living was no longer a quiet one. The Umnyama, the secretive order that had twisted her shadow, had sensed her return and began to marshal their final defense. The sky over Nkoyo grew darker, not from clouds, but from a shroud of unnatural magic that pulsed like a second heart above the village. The riverbed remained dry, cracked, and lifeless, but the air now carried tension, as if the river itself was holding its breath. Omoni stood at the threshold of her home, her feet touching the soil that had once embraced her joy. Her shadow, no longer a grotesque curse, flickered at her side, restored, but not yet whole. She knew this was only the beginning of the end. The creators of the curse were waiting, and they would not yield without a fight. The battle began in the place where the curse had been cast, a clearing surrounded by stone pillars marked with blood symbols and the ash of bone. There stood the circle of the Umnyama elders, cloaked in shadows and ancient spite. Their leader, a tall woman with skin like obsidian and eyes like hollow wells, stepped forward. You were never meant to return, she hissed. Your soul was offered, your shadow broken. The balance was ours to bend. Omoni's heart pounded, but she didn't waver. Behind her stood Kilo, gripping the owl's feather like a dagger, and Mara, blade drawn, her eyes locked on the shadowed warriors surrounding them. Elder Bako chanted softly, hands glowing with ancestral energy. The air shimmered with tension as the two forces stared each other down. Then the clearing exploded with light and dark. From the Umnyama's hands came tendrils of cursed smoke, seeking to bind and twist. Mara slashed through them, her blade cutting illusions like silk. Kilo leapt into the fray, shielding Omoni with his body as blasts of energy rained around them. Elder Bako stood still, channeling protective wards that flared with every strike. Omoni stood at the eye of the storm, shadow swirling around her like a cloak. One of the Umnyama called her name, not to taunt, but to awaken something. You are not whole, the figure said. The shadow still lives in you, unclaimed. Omoni looked down at her feet, her shadow moved erratically, flickering between her and the darkness. She closed her eyes, feeling the throb of ancient magic. to end this, she could not merely possess the shadow, she had to become it. In the chaos, time slowed. Omoni stepped into herself, into the pain, into the memories the shadow held. She relived her exile, the betrayal of her people, the loneliness in the spirit realm. She saw her shadow's birth, not as a curse, but as the part of her that had been silenced, feared. Her doubts, her rage, her questions. She embraced them, not to control them, but to understand. "I am not light without shadow," she whispered. "I am whole." Her body pulsed with energy. The shadow wrapped around her like armor, not to possess, but to protect. Her eyes turned silver, her voice deepened with resonance as she spoke words not taught but remembered. The river heard her. The ground beneath them cracked, and water surged from below, not gently, but like a roar. The dry riverbed trembled. A rush of wind spun around her as the spirit of the river revealed itself, a colossal form of glistening water, half woman, half serpent, eyes glowing like the moon. It hovered above them, its voice rippling across the sky. "She has returned. And she is no longer divided." The Umnyama faltered. Some dropped their spells, others turned to flee. But their leader screamed and unleashed a final wave of power, pure shadow meant to rip Omoni apart. Kilo rushed forward, trying to block the blast. The magic struck him full force, and he crumpled to the ground. "No!" Omoni screamed. Fueled by grief, she raised her hands, and the river spirit moved through her. Water burst from the earth and coiled through the air like living serpents, smashing into the dark mages, washing away their curses. The ritual stones shattered. The clearing lit up with blinding silver light. As the dust settled, silence followed. The leader of the Umnyama lay defeated, her form shrinking as her magic unraveled. Omoni stepped forward, not to kill her, but to speak. "You fed off fear. But the river flows for all. Even those who lose their way." The spirit above bowed its head and faded into mist, its task complete. Omoni ran to Kilo's side. His chest barely moved. She cradled him, tears mixing with the blood on his lips. "Don't you dare leave me," she whispered. The shadow around her flickered again, not with malice, but with memory. She placed her palm on his chest, whispering the chant Elder Bako once taught her. Her shadow moved into him, not to steal, but to share. Light glowed between them. Kilo gasped, his eyes fluttering open. "You brought me back," he said weakly. "No," she smiled through tears. "We brought each other back." All around them, the forest sighed. The darkness receded. The river, long silent, began to flow once more. It started as a trickle, then a stream, then a torrent, racing through its bed like a heartbeat returning after a long sleep. But the cost had been immense. Mara stood, bloodied and bruised, her blade broken. Elder Bako, too weak to stand, whispered thanks to the spirits before slipping into unconsciousness. The earth, though healing, still bore scars of the conflict. And Omoni, though victorious, felt a change within her. The shadow would always be with her now. Not as a curse, but as a reminder. The village would see her again, and perhaps fear her. But she would return not as a cursed girl, but as the river's guardian, both light and shadow, heart and blade. And the river would never again flow without her. The river flowed once more, but its song was different now, deeper, more layered, like it carried not just water, but memory. Where it once meandered gently through the village, it now moved with quiet purpose, churning with something ancient and awake. The villagers gathered along the banks, cautious and reverent, as if afraid to disturb its rebirth. Children who once played in its waters now watched in silence. Elders dipped their fingers and wept. The river had returned, yes, but none could deny it had come back changed. And so had she. Omoni stood at its edge, bare feet touching the cool earth that pulsed beneath her soles. Her shadow stood beside her, no longer twitching or detached. It moved with her, flowed like her breath, neither feared nor hidden. It had become part of her not through domination, but through understanding. And now, it whispered. In the stillness of dawn, she followed those whispers upstream, alone, past the forest where vines glowed with dew and roots whispered the old stories. She reached the source, the mouth of the river, where the waters bubbled from stone, endless and ancient. There, the river spirit waited. It did not take form this time, but existed in the glint of water, in the swirl of mist, in the thrum within her bones. Omoni knelt. Not in submission, but in unity. "Why me?" she asked softly. The mist responded not with words, but with images. A vision formed in the pool before her, of a time long before the village, when shadows danced freely and were not feared. Back then, shadows were storytellers, bridges to memory. But people began to fear the dark, and so they tried to cut it from themselves. They pushed their fears, their truths, their grief into the shadows, and the shadows, wounded by abandonment, twisted into curses. Omoni saw it all, how her bloodline had always been a tether between the seen and unseen. How she had carried the forgotten wisdom in her bones, though no one had told her. The river hadn't just flowed for water, it had flowed for memory, for stories, for balance. Her shadow hadn't been her enemy. It had been trying to remind her of what was lost. Tears welled in her eyes as the final truth settled in her chest. The curse had never truly been just a punishment, it had been a cry from the forgotten. Her shadow, stolen and misused, had merely magnified the imbalance already present. Her exile, her pain, her doubt, they had all been steps back toward the truth. She stood. At that moment, the water shimmered with light and shadow in equal measure. Flowers bloomed where none had bloomed before. Stones once dry turned smooth with glistening moss. The river's voice deepened, richer with the fullness of all it had reclaimed. When Omoni returned to the village, people did not rush to greet her. They parted for her in silence, eyes wide with awe. Some touched her robe, others bowed, but most just looked at her as if unsure whether she was still fully human. The elders invited her to the fire circle that evening. The oldest among them, Elder Naima, who had never before spoken in public since her husband's death, rose from her mat. "The river is different," she said. "And so are we. We feared shadows as evil. We forgot that they follow us because they belong to us." No one spoke. They simply listened as the fire cracked. Omoni took her place by the flames. Her voice, though soft, carried. "The shadow is not something to fear. It is the part of you that remembers. It holds your grief, your rage, your truth. When you cast it aside, it grows wild. When you accept it, you become whole." She told them of her journey, not just through mountains and spirits, but into herself. Of the moment she touched the curse and found a mirror, not a monster. Of the way the river spirit had not punished, but waited. And the villagers, those who had cursed her name only moons ago, now listened with heads bowed, shame and wonder mingling in their silence. A new ceremony was born that night. Not to worship the river, but to honor balance. Candles were lit not just for ancestors but for mistakes. 4 fears. 4 shadows. They sat together and spoke the truths they'd buried. And the river sang louder. Over the coming weeks, the crops began to return, richer than before. Fish filled the waters, but they were different, brighter, faster, with scales like flecks of obsidian. Even the trees seemed to bend toward the river, as if greeting an old friend come home. But not everything was as it had been. Omoni no longer walked freely among the people as she once had. Not because she was unwelcome, but because she had become something more. A guardian. A vessel. A reminder. Children whispered her name like magic. Women offered her herbs, not out of fear, but in gratitude. Men asked for her guidance before making decisions about the land. And though she missed the simplicity of her old life, Omoni did not shrink from this new role. Every morning she visited the river's mouth, and every night she sat with her shadow in silence. She no longer feared what it might show her. She had made peace with it. And in doing so, she had made peace with herself. The river no longer flowed just with water. It flowed with truth. With balance. With the memory of a girl who had once been broken and a shadow that had once been feared. Now, they were one. The day Omoni returned, the village held its breath. No one had seen her silhouette against the rising sun in weeks, not since she vanished into the spirit mountains with nothing but her will and the whispers of the river. Rumors had spread like wildfire. Some said she'd perished in the mountains, others whispered she had become one with the river itself. And then, without warning, the river burst into life days before her arrival. Water had surged through the dry beds as if startled awake from a deep slumber. The soil drank greedily, and the parched trees unfurled their leaves like green flames. Fish reappeared, sleek and fast, and the birds sang tunes no one remembered hearing before. The village was reborn, but still incomplete. Still waiting. Until now. She walked into the village with the sunrise behind her, casting a long, graceful shadow that moved in harmony with her steps. It was no longer a curse or something twisted by fear. It was whole, alive, and hers. People stared in silence. No one dared to speak first. The children huddled at their mothers' sides, their wide eyes peeking with awe. Farmers paused mid-swing with their hoes in the newly rich earth. The elders emerged from their clay huts, leaning heavily on staffs and memories. And then a boy, no older than 5, broke from the crowd. He ran to her, arms open, voice ringing out with joy. "Omoni!" His cry shattered the stillness. Suddenly, others followed, elders fell to their knees, mothers cried, and the youth, once skeptical, now held her hands with reverence. Omoni smiled faintly, her eyes misting, not just from their welcome but from the ache of what had been lost and reclaimed. She touched the boy's head gently and whispered, "The river waits for you too." That afternoon, a great gathering was held under the baobab tree. Its branches, once dry and brittle, now burst with green shoots and blossoms as though it too had missed her. Chief Baraka, who had once hesitated to support Omoni during the village's darkest days, stepped forward with lowered eyes. "We were wrong," he said, his voice trembling, "to doubt you. We were wrong to fear what we did not understand." Omoni stepped closer, not in anger but in grace. "You feared because no one taught you to listen to your shadow," she replied. "But fear isn't weakness. Refusing to learn from it is." He knelt, and others followed, murmuring apologies, old regrets rising like smoke from a long cold fire. In the following days, the healing of the land mirrored the healing of the people. Crops planted anew flourished in weeks instead of months. The irrigation channels that had been abandoned during the drought flowed once more, glistening like silver veins across the earth. Goats and cattle gave birth in abundance. Even the wind carried a different scent, less dust, more promise. Omoni didn't sleep in her old home. Instead, she built a small hut by the river's edge, where she could hear the current murmur through the night, and feel the pulse of the earth as she slept. She was no longer just a daughter of the village, she was its guardian now. People came to her, not as a prophet or a goddess, but as someone who had walked through death and shadow and returned with light. They brought their questions, their fears, their dreams. She listened to them all. She spoke little, but when she did, the words stayed in their hearts. She taught them the rituals of balance, not worship, but gratitude. Each season, a portion of the harvest was returned to the riverbank. Children were taught not to fear their shadows, but to speak to them. "The shadow listens," she told them, "because it remembers when you forget." One evening, as twilight painted the sky in purple and gold, Omoni was visited by Jabari, the same friend who had once risked everything to search for her during her exile. His hair had grayed at the temples, but his eyes were just as fierce. "You saved us," he said, sitting beside her as fireflies blinked like stars around them. "But you seem alone." Omoni looked at him and then at the river, which glowed with moonlight. "I'm never alone," she said. "The river keeps me. My shadow walks with me. And you're here." Jabari smiled, and they sat in silence, comforted by what words could never say. But peace, Omoni knew, was not something you earn once. It had to be maintained, protected. And though the river flowed strong, and the people had grown wiser, the world beyond the hills had not changed. There were still those who coveted what they did not understand. Still hearts filled with envy, still minds blind to the balance of nature. One night, the river sent her a dream. In it, the waters turned black and ran backward. A new shadow rose, not hers, but one unfamiliar. It didn't whisper like hers did. It screamed. The moon cracked, and silence fell like snow. When she awoke, her hand trembled. She did not speak of the dream to anyone. Not yet. The village was still healing. But she began preparations, new wards by the riverbank, rituals that bound memory to water, and messages sent quietly to distant lands where old allies might live. Because Omoni knew what others did not, the river had returned, yes. Harmony had been restored, for now. But the river remembered. It always did. And somewhere out there, in lands beyond the horizon, something had stirred. Still, she did not let fear take root. Instead, she stood by the river at dawn, feeling its power wrap around her like an old song. Her shadow stretched long and whole behind her, and she smiled. This time, she was ready. And so the river flowed, stronger than ever, carrying not just water, but truth. And where truth flowed, life followed. And the girl who was once a whisper, a scapegoat, a curse. She became legend. But not a legend of fear. A legend of balance. Of return. Of redemption. And of the shadow that taught a village how to remember.